We are talking about a conflict between the Nationalist Party of China, or the Kuomintang, it's often abbreviated KMT, the Kuomintang Party, and the Communist Party of China, or the CPC. Most people, when they think about the Chinese Communist Revolution, they think of it as being from 1945 to 1949, but it actually was in two phases. You can say that it ran from 1927 to 37, or some people would say from 1930 to 37. And then there was a break during the Second World War because China recognized that the primary enemy they had was Japan at that point, and so the communist forces, the nationalist forces joined for the period between 37 and 45, but then almost as soon as the Second World War was over, the Japanese had been defeated, they began again, and so from 1945 to end of 1949 is really the time in which all the resolution came to that. We start leading into that time with the last of the imperial dynasties of China, which was the Ching Dynasty. The Ching Dynasty lasted almost 3 centuries. It was the end of over 2,000 years of imperial dynasties in China, beginning, as we talked about this morning, with the Ching Dynasty, Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. And the Qin Dynasty was really for 100 years. In fact, they talk about the century of Chinese humiliation, because for all of the 1800s, Qing Dynasty China suffered one embarrassment or defeat after another. There were the 2 Opium Wars, in which Great Britain defeated them and forced the Chinese to accept the importation of opium, even though they were trying to keep it out of their country. I'll talk about that during the Opium Wars talk. The Boxer Rebellion, it had 8 different powers, including Japan, send forces in to try to quell a rebellion that occurred in China. Many of those forces left their troops in the country and took over various areas. Today, if you go to Qingdao, which is on the coast, the east coast of China, south of Beijing, it's a German city. Half of the city is built with German architecture. The Qingdao beer, which is the #1 beer in China, that brewery was built by German brewmasters, because after the Boxer Rebellion, the Germans were given the port of Qingdao for their control, and so they even refer to half of Qingdao now, if you visit there, as being the Germantown. So China had suffered all of this frustration, all of this humiliation. They then were defeated in the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and 95. They were pushed around by the Russians, and then finally, under the influence of a number of different revolutionary voices, particularly Sun Yat-sen was a revolutionary militant advocate for a different government in China. Various young intellectuals, young military officers, and also students in the early part of the 20th century began to really advocate for the declaration of a democratic China. And so in 1911, the forces came together, so at the end of 1911 and the beginning of 1912, the last emperor, Pu Yi, stepped down from the throne of the Qing Dynasty, and the People's Republic was declared. The Shanghai Revolution was responsible for having the declaration of the Republic of China on March 12th of 1912, with the capital in Nanking, which had been an ancient capital of China. At that point, Sun Yat-sen was made the president of China, as of the Republic, and he continued in that role for a very short time because another man named Yuan Shikai was the head of the army, and he also had been the prime minister of Qing Dynasty China, so he had a lot of political force as well as controlling the military. He forced Sun Yat-sen to step down, and he established himself as the leader, but he right away started abolishing various regional and provincial assemblies in favor of centralized control. And then in 1915, he declared himself the new emperor, and no one supported him in that. It's kind of hard to be emperor if no one else wants you to. So after a number of months of struggle, he finally stepped down in March of 1916, and died shortly thereafter. That left a power vacuum. And one of the things, as I say, the Shikai was the head of the military, and various generals of what was called the Beiyang army, which was the name of the army he had established, various generals decided that they thought they should be in charge at least of their region. And so we had what was called the Warlords era. It's not the only Warlords era in Japanese history, but it's the only one of the 20th century. And so we had these various military leaders who were declaring themselves independent rulers in various areas of China. And during this time, with all of the upheaval of that, Sun Yat-sen, who was still around, set up a rival government in Guangzhou in the 1920s, early 20s. He asked for help from the West. He turned to Western Europe and the United States and asked for support. And they refused to support him, they ignored him, and so he ended up turning to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union did provide support, financial support, and promise of military support as needed, in an effort to try to unify China, because during this period of time, communist influences in China, with the 1917 Russian Revolution, there was a great deal of intellectual support around the world, even in the West, for the ideals of the Russian Revolution. The intellectuals in China were very much enamored of this, and because they were very unhappy with the warring era and all was going on, there was a fairly strong communist party that had already developed in China. And again, when the Soviet Union stepped in to provide aid, that encouraged it even more. When they're providing aid, they also sent representatives to be sort of communist advisors to various of the communists and communist groups within China. So when Sun Yat-sen set up his alternate government, which he called the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, he did so in conjunction with the communist forces. So the original Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, was both the democratic forces and the communist forces working together. And this was an effort by Sun Yat-sen to try to unify the whole country. In March of 1925, Sun Yat-sen, however, died. And one of the other young leaders in the party was a man named Kai-Shek. And Chiang Kai-Shek was a military man, he was a general, and he ended up, in 1925, after the death of Sun Yat-sen, moving into the role of leading the Nationalist Party. Now, technically, there was still a government in China, in Beijing, although there really wasn't any leadership. They had some military leaders, so you had the military leadership of the formal government. Beijing was still recognized, it was called Beiping back then. Beiping was still recognized as being the capital of China by most of the world, but when the Kuomintang were formed, they started out in Guangzhou and then moved to Nanjing. So you had another capital that was being declared. And then you had all of these warlords around. It was a very messy time. In 1926 and 1927, Chiang Kai-Shek, who had become leader of the national military forces, he led his Kuomintang army in a route around, it's called the Northern Expedition, around China to defeat and to bring into submission the various warring era military leaders. And he was successful in that. He suppressed the warlords and their military ambitions. He unified the country, and at that point declared that the official government of China was now the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, centered in Nanking, or Nanjing, it sometimes has been called, rather than the sort of residual government that was still in Beiping. At that point, Chiang Kai-Shek was not in favor of the communist ideals. He felt like the communists were a bad influence, and so he began, as soon as they had completed this northern expedition, 1926-27, he declared opposition to the communists, threw them out of the Nationalist Party, and created the rift that led to the Civil War. So 1927, many people believe, is when you can say the war began, but officially there wasn't any formal war until 1930. Well, when Chiang Kai-Shek opposed the Communist Party of China, he not only ejected them from the Nationalist Party, but he began to actively prosecute them. In Shanghai, for instance, hundreds were arrested and executed simply because they were communists. This was called, the communists began to call that the Shanghai Massacre. And then in 1928, the people who had been communists, people who had left as deserters from the Kuomintang, the nationalist parties, and others who were disaffected joined together in 1928 into what was called the Chinese Workers and Peasants Red Army. Later on it was called the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA, but it was mostly peasants and deserters and defectors that got together and declared their intention to fight against the Nationalist Party that was persecuting the communists and to take power as soon as they could. Well, at this point, you end up with 3 different capitals. There was still had the international capital, although there wasn't much to it, in Beijing. You had the Communist Party set up their capital in Wuhan, and then the Nanjing capital of the Nationalist Party, which was primarily began to be recognized as the primary government. So in between October of 1934 and October of 1935, because of the military efforts by the Nationalist Party and Chiang Kai-Shek against the communists experienced what became known as the Long March. From areas down here, you'll notice these exits. This is because the nationalist forces, the purple area, the pink areas rather, was where the communists had centers. They slowly started being pushed south by the nationalist forces, and then they ended up 3 different 4 groups that were called the Second Army, the Fourth Army, and I'll remember in a minute what the third was called. They gathered together in a march that went all the way across much of the southern part of China and then north up to the area of Jiangxi up here, which is where they joined together and established a base of operations. This Long March, as it was called, of the 3 armies, which eventually joined in Jiangxi, was a march of 5,600 miles, or about 9,000 kilometers, that was done over 370 days. In other words, this army on foot marched an average of 16 miles a day through some of the roughest territory of China. Only 10% of the people who started on this march completed it. Most of them, 90% of them, dropped out as they went along, or many died. This Long March it became a major symbol of the communist struggle in China. They look back to that as one of the periods of greatness and of the dedication. It became a symbol of the commitment they had to survive and to establish communism in China. It was during this time period as well, between October of 1934 and October 1935, during the Long March, that Mao Zedong became recognized as the leader. He had been only one of a number of different people, but his leadership during the Long March really established him as the leader, the voice for the Communist Party. Then in 1937, as I mentioned, the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-Shek and the Communist Party under Mao Zedong agreed that their primary enemy was the Japanese. In 1937, the Japanese had declared the war for the second time, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and so Communists and Nationalists decided that they had to have a united front, and they did so from 1937 to 1945. Still, in terms of areas of influence, during this period of time, there were 3 primary areas. I mentioned this morning. The pink areas were where the Communists still had primary control. The dark blue area here were the areas of Manchuria and down the east coast, including the ports of Hong Kong and others, that the Japanese took control of. And then the lighter blue, which goes out here, was where the Nationalists controlled. And so you had 3 different forces controlling different areas of China during this period of time. Although it was a united front, the Communist Party were quite smart about this. They spent their energies generating local support from small towns, communities, country people, and they let the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-Shek fight most of the big battles against the Japanese. So the Communists sort of laid back and gathered together their resources while the Nationalists, Kuomintang, were being depleted by their war against the Japanese. I'm not saying that the Chinese didn't fight against the Japanese, they did, but they were very wise in how they marshaled their resources during this time, and by the end of the Second World War, in 1945, the nationalists were much less powerful than they had been when they started, and during that period of time, the Communist Party was very much on the rise because they had developed networks, they had developed a connection. There were a number of different problems that the Nationalist Party had and that developed during this time. First, their military effectiveness was greatly hurt by the Japanese. They were greatly weakened by the combat against the Japanese. Second, and one of the most important things, is because they were officially the government of China at this time. They were in charge of the monetary system and the economy, and they allowed rampant inflation in order to fund the national government, and particularly to fund the nationalist military efforts. They just kept printing money. And so the money was greatly devalued, and Chinese people who had investments of various kinds saw their life savings just gone because of the economic policies of the Nationalist Party, which of course lost them a significant amount of support. In fact, I would say probably one of the most important factors that led to the decline and eventual defeat of the Nationalists was the way they handled the economy and how many people were hurt by how they managed the economy. At one point, they introduced a new monetary system called the Golden Yuan. It was introduced at an exchange rate of 3 million to 1 against the old yuan, and they instituted very serious policies of serious punishment against anyone that did black marketing or anyone that tried to do any kind of monetary control sorts of things or mess with the new Golden Yuan. The problem was the people saw that anyone who was associated with the nationalist government, anybody who's had a government role or party member or whatever, they committed massive acts of corruption, which was another problem the nationalists had, and they were not punished for it. And so again, all of this loss of faith, this reduced morale, there was a huge dissatisfaction that developed against the intellectuals, even those that had been inclined to support the nationalists against the communists, lost faith in the Nationalist Party, and so they were active in terms of writing and speaking against what the nationalists were doing. I mentioned the corruption in a lot of ways, and corruption that often did not get punished if you were part of the Nationalist Party. And then finally, the nationalists were horrific in their oppression and suppression of any opponents. Anyone who spoke out against them could be arrested. There were executions. And so they simply alienated the general population of China during this period of time by how they treated their responsibility as the government. At the same time this was happening, the Communist Party, much smarter about it. For one thing, the Communists professed that they represented democracy and that their goal was to lead to a general democratic populace that would be able to make their own decisions about their lives. They created strong links to the peasantry around the nation. They created labor unions, women's organizations, youth organizations. They were very effective in creating ways to build a sense of association that the common people had with the Communist Party. They made the effort to communicate in a wide geographical area in the countryside with the common people, whereas the nationalists seemed only interested in the cities. And eventually the communists could claim a force of 900,000 soldiers if they needed to call on them, and perhaps 2 million more militia. They actually created a policy where various farmers in a village area or one geographical area would work together farming the land, and then when the need came, they would then leave and fight guerrilla warfare against either the Japanese or, when necessary, against the nationalists. And when that battle was over, they would come back and work the land. And because this scheme was developed by the communists, it respected the fact that these people still needed to grow food, rather than trying to conscript them and force them to leave their land and join the military, which the nationalists tended to do. So through all this time, the nationalists were losing their ability to represent the people, and the communists were gaining in that. Between May and September of 1944, there were a number of attempts at peace talks between these two groups, the nationalists and the communists. In fact, in 1944, the U.S. Vice President, Henry A. Wallace, came to China and he tried to mediate peace treatments, a peace agreement. There was a great deal of distrust, of ambition, of independence. Neither side wanted to give up the areas that they had gained control of for the sake of trying to find a peace agreement. they simply didn't trust one another enough to be able to make any gesture in that direction. And so the early peace efforts simply did not work. The Chinese Civil War is sometimes identified as being in three phases. When the Japanese were defeated in 1945, which again is when many people think of the Civil War starting, although it was really earlier than that, when the Japanese were defeated and began to withdraw from areas of Manchuria and other parts of China, both the nationalists and the communists raced to try to take control of those areas so that they would have influence over the areas in the northeast and along the coastal cities. And so because of those opportunities coming up in 1945, that the ambition there prevented progress being made in the various peace talks. Then in 1947, 1948, the communists, because they had built a much better base, began to win the advantage and push the nationalists back. For instance, this represents the march of the communist forces into Beijing. The communists were the ones that renamed it from Beiping to Beijing, by the way. And then finally, the communists were entirely on the offensive. The nationalists were entirely on the defensive in 1948 and 49. 48 was really the crux year when everything changed. But peace talks, at first, it looked like the peace talks might be successful. Then they waned, and then President Truman, the U.S. president, sent George Marshall, who was the creator of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, and eventually was Secretary of State after this. Well, George Marshall came to China, and he worked very hard as mediator, and in January of 1946, the two sides, nationalists and communists, actually declared an armistice, a ceasefire, and they agreed that they were willing to work together. They even came up with a specific plan under Marshall's leadership in which they had decided how the military was going to be defined between the nationalists and the communists, who would have control of what areas, how they would work together. It all looked great. But then in around that time, the Soviet Union withdrew from Manchuria. And Manchuria had always been one of the richest areas in China in terms of having industry, railways. Remember I talked about the South Manchurian Railway that the Japanese had built that also had mines and ports and all sorts of things. Well, when the Russians left Manchuria, all of a sudden there was a second race between the nationalists and the communists to try to take over in the vacuum that the Russians left behind. And that blew up all of the plans that they had for trying to work together and have a peace agreement. All of that went up in smoke. In fact, it ended up with George Marshall, after all of that exploded because of the ambition that both sides had to control this rich area of China. George Marshall finally left China after being there for many, many months, and he left right after issuing the scathing indictment against both sides, that they were too ambitious, too selfish to be willing to work together, and that as far as he was concerned, there was no hope for China to be unified again as long as those two parties continue to maintain that kind of attitude. So he left, and that was the point at which the United States really stopped being as involved. Later on, the U.S. had been greatly supporting the nationalist effort because it was seen as the alternative to the communists. But the nationalists ended up being just as corrupt, being very inefficient. The economic situation was in horrible shape because of the nationalists, and because they could not, even with George Marshall, probably the most important diplomat in the 20th century in the United States, unable to get them to work together, the U.S. finally sort of washed their hands on it. Later on, when Chiang Kai-Shek came back right before he had to withdraw to Taiwan and asked the United States for help again, to mediate some sort of peace, the United States response is that they did not see any positive results coming from that, and so therefore they would not be further involved. So all of this, inability to find any common terms was simply because of ambition, a desire not to give up the gains you had, and then with first the Japanese and then the Russians leaving, to be able to gain more property, more land, so that there was no willingness to come together. So all of this time, the Kuomintang is losing their advantage. They are losing battles. They're losing their weaponry. In fact, most of what the Communist Party ended up using later on in the war was stuff that they had taken that the Kuomintang had left behind, because they were constantly retreating and leaving their weapons, their tanks, their guns behind. There was still some consideration at this point they might find peace, but one side or the other would there would be a flare-up, or one side or the other would do something or say something that was unilateral, like Chiang Kai-Shek at one point got frustrated and he created a national congress without consulting the communists. At this point, Zhou Enlai, the primary ambassador for the Communist Party, who became the equivalent of the Secretary of State of Communist China later, he withdrew from the peace talks, and it was all over at that point by January of 1947. At this point, the Communist Party is entirely on the offensive. The Nationalist Party is entirely on the defensive. The USA has abandoned all efforts to mediate. As I said, 1948 was the decisive year in which that was the year actually that the Nationalists published the new currency, the Golden Yuan, which was a horrific debacle, made things much worse. And so the morale was really awful at that point. So that in 1949, after controlling virtually all of mainland China, the declaration was made by Mao Zedong on October 1st of 1949, the announcement that there was now the People's Republic of China, which claimed control of all of mainland China. The Kuomintang at that point asked again for the US, the UK, France, and the USSR to help, to step in, to stop all this. And all of them responded that they saw no benefit to anyone for that, because they did not trust that even if they had stepped in a major military way and put Chiang Kai-Shek back in power, that he would not be able to manage the country, that the nationalists would not be able to manage the country. And so, in December of 1949, Chiang Kai-Shek and 7 million of his followers left mainland China and went to, this is so light it's hard to see, went to the island of Taiwan. You can see a little better over there, the island of Taiwan. They made Taipei their capital, and they declared this the Republic of China. So you now had the People's Republic of China under the Communist Party on mainland China. You had the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-Shek and the Nationalists on the island of Taiwan, a very small island compared to mainland China, of course. Unfortunately, Chiang Kai-Shek, when he got to Taiwan, he instituted quite draconian kind of control efforts there as well. It was a number of years after Chiang Kai-Shek's death before they ended up having really a democratic, even though that was the premise of the Nationalist Party, to have a democratic government and control in Taiwan. There also was a struggle because in 1945, when they created the United Nations at the end of the Second World War, Republic of China, at that point, with Chiang Kai-Shek as their leader, the Generalissimo, he was seen as one of the major allies. There are all these photographs that you see of Churchill and Truman or initially FDR and Chiang Kai-Shek, and then later Truman and Chiang Kai-Shek. So when they created the UN, the representative of China to the United Nations was Chiang Kai-Shek. It was the Republic of China. Then when they were defeated in 49 and forced to Taiwan, there was many years of conflict over now who should be the representative. Chiang Kai-Shek had a seat on the Security Council, which means he had power of veto over things. There was a lot of effort immediately after the People's Republic of China was declared. Russia, all of the Eastern Bloc countries that Russia had taken over, and all of Russia's allies immediately recognized the People's Republic of China. And they began to push very early on that the People's Republic, Communist China, be the representative of China on the Security Council, rather than the much smaller Republic of China. The United States initially was the primary voice, although Western powers early on didn't want to make that change either. They didn't want to show that support for Communist China. And yet, over a period of time, eventually more and more people came to the side of saying the People's Republic of China represents 95% of the population of China, and so therefore they should be the representatives. Finally, Albania, after several years of Albania, of all countries, being the ones that would propose the change in seating the People's Republic of China on the Security Council and being the official representative of China, the United States finally agreed to allow that to happen. Part of it was because of the 1971 meetings, the sort of détente between Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, meeting with Mao and Zhou Enlai, and agreeing that they would have more open relations. And the U.S. finally stopped, actually the policies had changed. They didn't have to have a unanimous vote anyway, and the U.S. would probably have been outvoted at that point. But the agreement was made that in 1971, the People's Republic of China, same year that Nixon went to China, the People's Republic of China became the China representative in the UN. Both the People's Republic of China and Taiwan still maintain a one China policy. What that means is that mainland China, the People's Republic, insists there is only one China and it's them. Taiwanese Republic of China insists there is only one China and it's them. And so they have never been able to come to agreement. China, the mainland China, the People's Republic of China, has threatened an invasion of Taiwan, and I don't think anybody has real serious questions as to how that would go unless there was major, intercession from the United States and other powers. But they have said that if Taiwan ever declares themselves to be the sole China, if they ever represent themselves as that officially in any way, that they will invade Taiwan, that the mainland People's Republic will invade. For instance, then when Taiwan, the Republic of China is involved in the Olympics, they have to present themselves as Chinese Taiwan. They cannot call themselves just China, because the Republic of China, People's Republic of China, has said that they would take military action if they ever do that. That's part of their sense of the struggle over the one China policy. This is the way it looks now, and you get a perspective. This is mainland, the People's Republic of China, Communist China. This is Taiwan, right here. The Formosa Strait is all that separates the two. They're very close together. In fact, even after Taiwan, the Republic of China, was established, there are a number of other islands there that, just to prove they could, the People's Republic of China, mainland China, took those islands away from Taiwan, and there was really nothing they could do about it. And so there's always this balance on a knife edge between these two, and it continues today, much like what has been happening since 1952-3 between North and South Korea, same kind of thing. In terms of the Chinese Civil War, there were 105 million dead from the People's Liberation Army, that is the Communist Chinese side. There were 600,000 killed from the Kuomintang, the nationalist side. 1.8 million Kuomintang military soldiers defected. That's the frustration that they had with the way that the Nationalist Party was running the government and the military. 1.8 million people defected over to the communist side. 7 million of the Kuomintang were captured during the war, and it's estimated that 5 million civilians died either from combat, from famine, or disease. There was a great deal, it's recognized now, there were atrocities committed by both sides, Communist China and the Nationalist Party, during the Chinese Civil War. It was quite a horrific time, and China still struggles over that separation. But that is why we have two Chinas, the People's Republic of China on the mainland and the Republic of China on Taiwan. As I say, when I mentioned this morning, when Chiang Kai-Shek and the nationalists left the mainland and went to Taiwan, they took most of the treasury and most of the national treasures, meaning the historical artifacts, the great works of art from the past. They took most of that with them to Taiwan. If you go to Taipei today and you go to the Imperial Palace Museum, you can see all that stuff. Well, during the Cultural Revolution, most of that kind of thing was destroyed in mainland China, because the theme of the Cultural Revolution was to destroy outside influences and pre-communist influences. And since most of those things represented the history of pre-communism, much of that was destroyed in China. And Taiwan, to this day, sort of grins and says, see all this stuff that you can still see because the Republic of China exists on Taiwan? And if it's still been in China, and they make a big point of that if you visit the Palace Museum, if it had still been in China, most of the stuff would have been destroyed. So, questions about the Chinese Civil War? Yes, Josette?
对，现在 under Taiwan, it's written Japan. So did those islands happen to belong to Japan, or did they just went to that island? Who did it belong to at this point?
Right, originally Taiwan was part of China, and then when Japan defeated China in the first Sino-Japanese War in 1894-95, Taiwan was one of the places that was given to Japan at the end of the war. They gave them the island of Taiwan, the Pescadores Island. They gave them control of some other islands along there, as well as control of Korea while it was still an independent nation. China had pretty much run the place, and the Liaotong Peninsula in Manchuria. All of those were pieces that the Chinese ceded to Japan at the end of the first Sino-Japanese War in the late 1890s. And then later on, after it was taken back by China, and it sort of bounced back and forth, but it was part of China during the Civil War period and until the end of the Second World War. Okay? Other questions? Yes, Joe?
In reading Barbara's Tuffman, one of the things that she pointed out about this time period was that Henry Luce, who was born there and spoke the language well, was convinced that through Madame Ching, that the nationalists would all become Presbyterian and convert.
That would be good.
Yeah.
Since I'm a Presbyterian minister. So.
I understand. And that the president, I think both Roosevelt and certainly Truman, kind of kept the relationship going with Chiang Kai-Shek as much as they could, but as you pointed out, they eventually said, we can't deal with this guy.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you heard that, Madame Chiang Kai-Shek, which especially after the death of the Generalissimo Chiang Kai-Shek, became a major diplomatic figure in the world. She was highly respected. She was from the West, and so people, she really was a bridge in a lot of ways. And the idea, I actually had not heard that, but that she had proposed that eventually all of the nationalists would become Presbyterian, and that they then would resolve that problem. And since I'm a Presbyterian minister, of course, I like that idea, although I'd not heard that before. But the West did not break ties, official ties with Taiwan. They simply said, we're not going to intercede anymore. It was still always the hope that because of, Truman, for instance, had clearly declared his desire for communism to be limited, for it not to expand. This was the reason for the involvement in the Second World War. In the Korean War, is because Truman committed American troops because he saw this as a clear expansion of communism into democratic Southern Korea. Well, the same thing, they could not officially sever ties with Chiang Kai-Shek because he represented the only alternative in China to the Communist Party. However, they reached the point where they said, we can't really do anything actively to support him because we've been doing that for how many years and what were the results? So at that point, the response was, hey, we love you, guy, but us helping you is not going to help anybody. So we're going to stay out of this from now on. But yeah, I hadn't heard the Presbyterian side. That was good. In the back, yes, Pat. On the Taiwanese who? I don't know anything about the people of Taiwan that had lived there before. I mean, all of a sudden they had 7 million people from mainland China drop on their island and take over. I really don't have a lot of expertise on the specific response or reaction to that. I wish I did. That's something that I would need to study more. So I always want to be honest if I don't know something, and I can't really speak to that. Sorry. Other questions? Yes.
Those disputed islands that you talked about after Taiwan took over, were two of those islands, Quemoy and Matsu, those figured prominently in the Nixon-Kennedy debates during the presidential election. I remember that, and whether or not we would defend Taiwan if mainland China tried to take those.
Once again, I don't know. I don't know the specific islands. If they're part of the Pescadores chain, then yes, that was part of the Japanese involvement there. But I'm not sure about that. I would have to look it up. So Matsu and what was the other one?
Quemoy.
Quemoy.
Quemoy and Matsu.
Okay, I'll have to check on that. I sometimes have said I should issue a disclaimer that I can't answer any questions for anything that's happened in the last 100 years or so, because that's, my field is older than that. But anyway, we'll get that.